Hello, my name is Bill Sellers. I'm the president of National History Academy, and welcome to our series of defining historic sites with virtual tours. Today, we're thrilled to visit Ford's Theater and learn about Lincoln's legacy from Alex Wood at Ford's Theater. With National History Academy, we're starting our fourth summer this year, our second summer online after 2 summers in person, and we're just starting our recruiting now. So if you're a high school student or middle school student interested in participating in the program, we've got a series of 4 one-week programs, and we're developing some history workshops. We're studying cases developed by Harvard Business School professor David Moss with his History of American Democracy series. Virtual tours, much like we're doing today, of related historic sites, and are going to have a number of prominent speakers over the course of the summer. So please check out our website at www.nationalhistoryacademy.org. And now I'm very privileged to introduce Dr. Brent Glass, who's worked with us from the beginning of National History Academy. Brent is the Director Emeritus of the Smithsonian National Museum of American History and has a distinguished career before that. And Brent, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Bill, and I'm delighted to welcome our audience to today's field trip at Ford's Theater. The National History Academy is performing a very unique role in our public memory in this country right now. And I like to say that history is a resource that helps us understand our own times, and that is true also for historic sites. And the National History Academy has integrated the power of place, these virtual field trips, and also in-person field trips in our summer program to use the history and historic sites as resources for understanding our own times. And I think you will definitely reach that conclusion with today's field trip to Ford's Theater. I'm very delighted to introduce Alex Wood, who is the education programs manager at Ford's Theater and Lincoln's Legacy.
Thank you, Brent. I'll go ahead and share my screen. All right. Well, thank you all so much for joining us today. I'm really excited to take you virtually to Ford's Theater and share our story with you this afternoon. So diving right in, here's Ford's Theater on 10th Street Northwest in Washington, D.C. As you might recognize it on your average spring day with that huge crowd of people waiting to come visit. Ford's Theater has been standing on 10th Street for over 160 years. And has been witness to sort of the great changes and tremendous amounts of history that have happened in our capital city ever since then. One of the things that's really special, especially as we are connecting with friends and colleagues from all over the country, is that Ford's Theater is a National Park Service site, so it belongs to all of you. And I grew up in California, and Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. felt really far away and really long ago. But I urge you, and I hope that you are all inspired to really recognize and feel a sense of ownership about this place that is so important in our country's history. All right, so Ford's Theater is an important historic site worthy of your field trip this afternoon because it is the place where President Lincoln was assassinated in 1865. So here we are looking at 2 images of President Lincoln. One on the left, pre-beard, is Lincoln in 1858, and the photo on the right is one of his last portraits from the end of his life. And I like showing this slide because I don't know if you've seen sort of the presidential portraits of pre-presidency and post-presidency. The presidency really ages our presidents a lot. It's a stressful job. There's a lot that they have to handle and deal with, and all of the decisions that they have to make. And I feel like even in Lincoln's face, you can really see the changes that those years wrought on him. So as we start to paint the picture of how Ford's Theater plays its part in this story, we need to sort of set the stage and talk about what Lincoln was facing as he became president. He was elected president in 1860, was inaugurated in 1861. So this is a map of the United States that President Lincoln would have been familiar with. Those gray states are the slaveholding states. The pink states are the free states, and the green section are the territories, not yet states. And as Lincoln was running for president and as he was elected president, the big question on the edge of everyone's consciousness was, what was the future of slavery going to be? Would it stay where it was? Would it expand into new states as those territories joined the Union as states? Would it be abolished and ended completely, made illegal in the country? And Lincoln was known to be an anti-slavery candidate. So when he was elected president, a group of states in the South got together and decided to break up with the country. They seceded and tried to start their own country in which the institution of slavery would be embedded in their new constitution. And if you read all of the secession documents, they all name slavery as the reason why they want to leave the United States and start anew. President Lincoln said, no, you're not allowed to do that. And that, you know, it's not allowed to just break up with the United States. It's unconstitutional. And then, of course, as we know, looking back at all that happened, by the end of the Civil War, slavery would be abolished in the United States as well. So zooming into our capital city, this is a drawing of Washington City towards the end of the Civil War. I like this drawing because it starts to give us a real different sense of what Washington looked like for President Lincoln than how it looks for us today. So here in this map, you can identify the Washington Monument. Notice how it is not finished yet. It's kind of a stump of a monument. Also notice how it's right on the river's edge. That is unusual, not the landscape of our city today. If you are looking closely, you might be wondering where the Lincoln Memorial is. Not yet built. Would be off the image here. The White House is just northish of the Washington Monument. Pennsylvania Avenue, our main avenue through downtown Washington. You can see it wide here, connecting the White House to the United States Capitol building, which is huge, dominates the landscape. Looking at this map or this drawing, also, you can look toward the horizon. And as you look towards those clouds, there's kind of a definite line where the city ends, and beyond the city is countryside, hillside. So Washington during the Civil War was really compact, sort of densely squished right up there against the river's edge. The city of Washington on the eve of the Civil War was kind of this small, funky town. We'll notice in some of the pictures we're about to look at that there are dirt roads. And when the Civil War started, the population of Washington tripled. So huge floods of people were coming into the city. And as the city just sort of exploded, it expanded, it had to grow really fast to accommodate all of these people who were coming into the city. There were soldiers, there were refugees fleeing slavery, there were business people and industry workers who were taking advantage of the wartime economy. And all of that life was just bursting at the seams, and the city had to sort of grow and expand really quickly to keep up. All right, let's zoom in some more, or zoom out rather. So here's a map of the city. Gives us a little bit of a sense of the lay of the land. So the Potomac River, which separates the city of Washington from the Commonwealth of Virginia. Virginia was one of the states that seceded, and in fact, it had the capital city of the Confederacy, Richmond. Richmond is only about 100 miles from Washington, and so it was a day's horseback ride, right? Really close. So already we have this sense that Washington is on the front lines of the Civil War, quite literally. The other state that surrounds the District of Columbia is Maryland. And Maryland was one of those border states. So Maryland stayed in the United States. It didn't secede, but it was a slaveholding state. And so there were plenty of Southern sympathies and Confederate sympathies in Maryland. Notice too how Maryland is just as far south as Virginia in parts of it. So there was a lot of tension in Maryland. There was enemy territory in Virginia. And all of that fed directly into the city as it's surrounded by slaveholding states and surrounded by the war. The blue X's in this map are forts. There were 68 forts hastily built to defend the city of Washington. Notice how most of the forts are on those southern edges, lots in Virginia. Some of the forts still exist today. A couple of them have been restored or preserved, and some others are only evident in name. So we have a metro station, Fort Totten. Fort Totten was one of the Civil War forts up here. There's a condo complex in Alexandria called Fort Ellsworth, and that was this Civil War fort here. So, the United States Capitol building, we're zooming right into downtown. This is the Capitol as you might recognize it today. Finished, brilliant, shining in the sun. The tippy top has a statue. That statue is facing eastward. That is the Statue of Freedom. And so we see in this building, you know, not only a practical office building where Congress goes to work, but it's also a building full of symbolism. It symbolizes our government, it symbolizes our ideals, and then it's topped with the Statue of Freedom, this big idea that's so important to us in this country. And it was so important and right at the heart of the Civil War, right? This question of freedom and what does freedom mean? This is the Capitol as President Lincoln might have recognized it when he first got to Washington. Notice that it is under construction. So the city of Washington was very unfinished at the start of the Civil War. There was some tension about whether or not to continue construction on the Capitol Dome during the Civil War, what with resources being scarce and needed for the war effort. But President Lincoln and others knew how important it was to complete this building, that it would stand out against the landscape. You can see it from miles around. If you think back to the image we looked at, the drawing of the city of Washington, the Capitol building is enormous. And so to have a finished Capitol in the heart of the capital city was a really important message to send to everyone living in Washington and anyone who could see it for miles around, that the government was here to stay, the United States was here to stay, that there was confidence in a victorious outcome at the end of the Civil War. This picture also does a really good job of giving us a sense of how gritty Washington City was. If you were to visit the Capitol today, this land that we'd be standing on would be sort of this beautifully landscaped, curated park. But here we see this sort of muddy road, tons of trees and foliage, and this body of water. It's not a fountain, it's not a pool. This is the Washington City Canal, which connected water from the Potomac River right through the heart of downtown Washington. And it was intended to reach back out to the eastern branch of the Potomac River. Today we know that as the Anacostia River. This canal was supposed to be a major thoroughfare for transporting goods and people via boat through the heart of the city. But looking at this picture, you can see that's not exactly what's going on. There's this whole pile of, I don't know, it looks like lawn clippings or something. But the canal was this great thoroughfare. It never really came true. Instead, the canal became more like an open sewer in the heart of the city. People would just dump trash in there. The 1860s are before the era of indoor plumbing, so it was just full of nastiness. there was a lot of disease and sickness and stink coming out of this canal. So as we think of our capital city and we send ourselves back in time, we can think about how it smelled. Any of you who have visited us in the summer know that it's hot and humid. So pretty unpleasant place to be. All right, Ford's Theater. Now and then, looking at this comparison, notice how the building, the exterior of Ford's Theater is almost exactly the same. So it's one of the remarkable things about this historic site is those exterior bricks have been standing there witness on 10th Street. The buildings around it have completely changed. Notice the roads, the dirt roads here in our Civil War Washington. There's a horse and carriage at the end of the block. So Ford's Theater is only 6 blocks from, or it's just up the street from the Washington Monument. So here is the Washington Monument as you would recognize it today. It's 555 feet, 5 1/8 inches tall. And notice in this picture, the color changes about 1/3 of the way up. So that line is as tall as the monument was during the Civil War. This would have been Lincoln's view out his window in the White House, looking south towards the Washington Monument in the background there. So they started construction on the Washington Monument well before the Civil War. President Lincoln was actually present at the cornerstone laying, not as president, but as Congressman Lincoln back in 1848. The money ran out and they were not able to continue construction on the Washington Monument. So it sat there unfinished for 20 years. In the middle of that time was the Civil War. And we see here Treasury Guard soldiers standing out on the south lawn of the White House, posing in front of that unfinished monument. Unlike the Capitol, where Lincoln and others prioritized completing that building, even though the Civil War was going on, the Washington Monument was not completed until the 1880s. So if we turn around and look back towards where Lincoln would be looking at us from the White House, this is probably what you would notice if you tried to take a picture of the White House today, an enormous fence blocking your view. But this is President Lincoln's White House. This photograph was taken in 1863. You'll notice there is no fence. Wild for us to imagine. There's people just out on the lawn. I particularly like this fellow just sitting with his knee up, hanging over this wall. He looks like he's just having a relaxing afternoon on the grounds of the White House. A far cry from our experience if you were to walk over there nowadays. So one of the things that's really remarkable to think about is how little security President Lincoln had and how accessible he was to the average citizen. So if you wanted to speak to President Lincoln during the Civil War, you could wake up in the morning, go to the White House, no appointment necessary, and knock on the door. Get in, ask to see the president. You would probably have to wait your turn. You might not get to see him just because there were so many other people there. But President Lincoln sort of kept office hours. He made a point to meet with the people who came to see him. In addition to his cabinet members and other government officials, he would meet with individuals who were seeking appointment to political office, or they wanted his assistance. You know, maybe they had a family member across enemy lines and they needed permission to go retrieve them and bring them back to Washington. So President Lincoln was sort of surrounded by people and their requests and their needs and their ideas every day, day in and day out, here in the White House. And the White House was very much a part of the city. It was a place that was very accessible to your average Washingtonian. And that's important for us to remember, because when we get to the part about President Lincoln being assassinated in Ford's Theater, sometimes we have a hard time imagining how an actor could get to President Lincoln, no questions asked. But we need to remember how accessible President Lincoln was to anyone, any day. And it starts to make a little more sense. So in addition to all of those people and his government officials and his colleagues and his cabinet, President Lincoln was in the White House with his family. And so here we see depicted Mary Lincoln, Mrs. Lincoln over on the left, gazing lovingly at her family. Willie Lincoln is seated in the center here. Tad was the youngest. He's looking over his father's shoulder. And Robert is here in the back. So Robert Lincoln was college age. He was going to university. He was in and out of the White House, in and out of Washington. He desperately wanted to join the United States Army to support his father in the war. He finally got to join as sort of an assistant in General Grant's camp. But his mother was deeply concerned for his safety. The two younger boys, though, sort of ran amok in the White House. And from all reports of the time, the Lincolns kind of spoiled their children. They were really indulgent of their children. They loved their children sort of in a much more public and obvious way than was fashionable in the 1860s. The Lincolns allowed their children to have pets. They had 2 pet goats, which is a little surprising. They would actually let these goats come into the White House. And they would sort of like ride them through the halls and knock stuff over. I see a question in the chat from Leanne. How easy was it to see Mrs. Lincoln? You know, I've never been asked that before. She was out and about. Mrs. Lincoln would actually go visit soldiers in hospitals, and she would sometimes help them write letters if they couldn't write for themselves, either because they didn't know how or they were injured and couldn't write. I know Mrs. Lincoln had a deep appreciation for the importance of being the hostess and being the first lady. I don't know if she had a lot of petitioners coming to visit her, though. That's a good question. I know that she was really well educated and she was very politically minded, and she had a lot of opinions about her husband as president, and that put her into a lot of tension with some members of his cabinet. They, by all accounts, did not esteem her. Really fascinating woman, Mrs. Lincoln. The Lincolns suffered a deep personal tragedy during their time in the White House. Willie Lincoln got sick from probably typhoid fever, most likely caught from that nasty canal, and he died. And this really devastated the family. Mrs. Lincoln went into mourning. President Lincoln wore a black mourning ribbon on his hat all the way through, his own assassination. And Tad lost his best friend. And so thinking about the family struggling with this personal grief, President Lincoln couldn't take bereavement leave. He didn't get to go on vacation. He couldn't say, "Dear country, put the Civil War on hold, please. I have to deal with the loss of my son." He had to keep working through it. And now he had this intensely personal connection to all of the other families who were losing their sons and fathers and brothers and loved ones in the Civil War. If we remember, almost 700,000 people died during the Civil War. It affected everyone. And the Lincolns were right in there with it. As a part, one of the ways that President Lincoln was able to offer some respite to his family, he took advantage of an invitation to use this cottage as a summer retreat. So this house was located on the grounds of the Old Soldiers' Home, or the U.S. Military Asylum. It's a retirement facility to this day for veterans. And this house, which today is a museum in its own right, President Lincoln's Cottage, was made available to the Lincoln family. Now, they never owned this house. They were invited to use it, and they made it their summer home after Willie died. It was a way to get out from downtown, away from that canal. It's up on a hill. It's about 3 miles out of town. But once again, President Lincoln didn't get to take vacation, right? So he would commute daily from the cottage to the White House and back home again. Returning to this map so we can get a little oriented, here is the cottage up at the U.S. Military Asylum. And the White House is just about 3 miles south, down in the heart of DC. Now, President Lincoln would often do this commute alone. So there would be guards assigned to escort him around the city, and sometimes he would give them the slip. He would leave before they had arrived to pick him up. Sometimes he would be accompanied through town, in a carriage with bodyguard and soldiers, but oftentimes he would want to be alone, to be on this commute. And in that commute, he would pass by communities of refugees escaping slavery. He would pass by hospitals and wounded soldiers and nurses. I think there's Walt Whitman was a nurse during the Civil War, and he wrote about seeing President Lincoln and sort of the melancholy look on his face as he rode his horse through town between the cottage and the White House. All right, returning our attention to the forts. So all of the forts that surround Washington, most of them are located here at the southern edge of the city. Makes sense, right? The Confederacy is in the south. You would think they would attack the city from the south, but no. The one time the Confederate Army actually attacked the city of Washington was at the northernmost fort, Fort Stevens. And Fort Stevens is very close to President Lincoln's cottage. So here's a picture of Fort Stevens. So the Battle of Fort Stevens happened in July of 1864. So it was summertime. The city got word that Confederate troops were marching on Washington and that they would be attacking from the north. They would be marching down through Maryland, remembering how complicated Maryland was at the time. So President Lincoln actually went to Fort Stevens to watch the battle. And he watched as Confederate soldiers fired upon the fort, and as Union soldiers who were rushing up to this northern fort to defend the city, they fired back. And actually, one of the Confederate sharpshooters spotted President Lincoln and shot at him. Missed, hit the guy next to him. But, somebody grabbed President Lincoln and pulled him down, said, "Get down, you fool," pulled him into safety. So President Lincoln is our only president to attend a battle while president, as sitting president. The United States Army was able to defend the city that day. It was victorious in the Battle of Fort Stevens, and the Confederate Army had to retreat. So the city of Washington was safe. Thinking more about the people who President Lincoln would be interacting with daily. So we talked about the soldiers, we talked about his family. This woman is Elizabeth Keckley, and she actually was really good friends with Mrs. Lincoln. And she became friends with Mrs. Lincoln because Elizabeth Keckley was a very well-established and successful dressmaker in Washington. Her story is extraordinary. She was born into slavery in Virginia. Her enslavers moved her and their family to St. Louis. In St. Louis, she was sewing, she was a seamstress, she was a dressmaker, she was hired out, and she was able to save some of that income and earn enough money and save up enough money to purchase her own freedom and the freedom of her son. And so with her freedom, she and her son moved to Washington, D.C., and she started her own business. And she was building dresses and designing dresses for all of the sort of high society ladies in Washington. And she was introduced to Mrs. Lincoln. Mrs. Lincoln loved her fashion. She loved her dresses. She ordered many dresses from Mrs. Keckley, and they also became friends and confidant. And Elizabeth Keckley became a confidant of Mrs. Lincoln. Elizabeth Keckley wrote a memoir, which I highly recommend you all go check out. But she described, it's called Behind the Scenes, 30 Years a Slave and 4 Years in the White House. And she describes her whole life's journey. And then it's a really intimate family view of what life was like in the White House for Mrs. Lincoln and Mr. Lincoln and their children. Since her own story was so deeply connected to the greater struggles of the Civil War, Elizabeth Keckley was very involved in supporting those refugee communities, those contraband camps, the sort of emergency camps built up and assembled to help house and provide for the people who were fleeing slavery and trying to start lives anew in freedom. So Elizabeth Keckley was one of the founders of the Contraband Relief Fund, and she was fundraising to help build school buildings and housing and hospitals and provide medical attention and education and, church for these communities of refugees. And she actually got the Lincolns to donate $200 of their own money to this Contraband Relief Fund. So she was deeply involved in the inner workings of the city and on sort of the ground level, and also in sort of the parlors of the ladies of Washington society. Frederick Douglass was also a recognizable face in and around the White House. Frederick Douglass's story is also an extraordinary one. He was born into slavery in Maryland. He seized his freedom by running away. And after meeting up with abolitionists in New York, he traveled to England. He started raising money through his public speaking and selling his autobiography. He came back to the United States and was able to secure the safety of his freedom by purchasing his freedom. And he became sort of deeply involved with President Lincoln, particularly about emancipation and the United States Colored Troops, which is the African-American soldiers of the United States Army, who were made possible by the Emancipation Proclamation. So the Emancipation Proclamation laid the foundation for the abolition of slavery. It promised freedom, forever free, to anyone who was enslaved in the territories that were in rebellion. And it also allowed African-American men to join the United States Army as soldiers and fight for their country and fight for emancipation. This was something that had been denied to them up until this point. Many of the African-Americans who found themselves in Union camps or working among Union lines, they weren't allowed to be soldiers. So, even we can see in all of these examples that tension of the promised ideal, the actual manifestation of prejudice and discrimination in the everyday life. But so the Emancipation Proclamation actually enabled African-American men to join the United States Army and fight for their freedom. And Frederick Douglass was very involved in recruiting soldiers to enlist in the USCT. 2 of his own sons joined the USCT. And then he met with President Lincoln in the White House to debate and argue for the rights of these soldiers. He argued they were advocating for equal pay. They were advocating for just and humane treatment. And almost 200,000 African-American men joined the United States Army and helped the Union win the war. And in addition to winning the battles that needed to be won and helping the Union to victory, these soldiers also proved themselves. They smashed the preconceptions and prejudices of, those racist ideas that formerly enslaved men wouldn't make good soldiers, or that they were undisciplined, or any of that sort of horrible prejudice that was pervasive in the leadership of the time, these soldiers were able to prove all of that wrong. They were courageous, and they were, they demonstrated valor on the battlefield. And their actions really helped persuade a lot of those prejudiced ideas and prejudiced thinkers. Oh, good question from Michelle. Going back to the Lincoln Boys, do you know whether the Lincoln Boys had playmates at the White House like the Roosevelt kids? Yes, they did. There's a really charming memoir called Tad Lincoln's Father, and it's written by a woman named Julia Taft Bain, and she was like their babysitter, and her younger brothers were the playmates of the Lincoln Boys. One of the sort of great tragedies of that story is, though, after Willie died, Mrs. Lincoln was so broken by that she couldn't bear to see the other children because it reminded her too much of the joy that Willie had had with them. So they stopped playing together. Also, the White House butler, William Slade, had young children who were about Tad's age. And he was African-American, and his children would come to the White House and Tad would go to their house to play. So that's pretty remarkable as well. Good question. Did any African-American soldier visit the White House or be decorated by Lincoln? Oh, I do not know. I will have to look into that. That's a really good question. We'll have to dig deeper into our USCT history to answer that question. Thank you for stumping me. I'll be able to answer it next time. Okay. So on March 4th, 1865, Lincoln was inaugurated for the second time. He won re-election the previous fall. And in his second inauguration, he delivered his very famous second inaugural address. And the inauguration is the ceremony where the president takes the oath of office. And the speech, the address, is the president's opportunity to share his vision for the next 4 years with the country. And the country is not just the people who voted for him, right? It's everyone who is now going to be part of this government of the people, by the people, for the people, right? So this speech is really extraordinary. It is most famous for its conclusion, with malice toward none and charity for all, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who has borne the battle and for his widow and his orphan. It's a very healing message about moving forward together. But what's really interesting is before President Lincoln gets to that healing, forward-looking, hopeful message, he really lays it out that the Civil War was about slavery and that both North and South are at fault. And that this war, which has cost so much, has ruined and destroyed so many lives. He says that the cost of the war might be the price the country is being made to pay for the scourge of slavery, the sin of slavery. He says, if every drop of blood drawn by the lash should be paid with a drop of blood drawn by the sword, then that's what God wills. It's a really powerful an intense speech where he just says, we're all in this. We're all at fault. And so we all must work together to heal this wound of the war and this wound of slavery, and to come together and move forward in the future. Barely a month later, Robert E. Lee surrenders his army of Northern Virginia to General Ulysses S. Grant. When Lee surrenders his army, that's it for the Confederacy. It's not technically over. There are still troops out in the field. There are still a few battles to be fought and won, but there is no hope for Confederate victory after Lee surrenders his army. And very importantly, the immediate threat to Washington is over. So people in Washington, they hear about Lee's surrender and they start to party, literally party. They set off fireworks and rockets and they light bonfires and they go parading through the streets. And the city of Washington, the mayor declares a grand illumination, and all of the businesses and private homes in downtown put thousands of candles in their windows to light up the city at night. And the Willard Hotel and the post office and the patent office, all of these major government buildings and private businesses that have the resources use gas torches to spell out words like victory and union. And they spell out the names of Lincoln and Grant and Sherman. And it's this enormous party in Washington. It's like the 4th of July and New Year's Eve times 100. And Lincoln, too, is enjoying this celebratory atmosphere. Now, on April 11th, a group of people go to the White House. They're singing songs. They parade up to the White House. They call out for President Lincoln to make a speech. And this speech, you know, they're hoping it's going to be a beautiful, poetic victory speech. It's not really. It's much more nitty-gritty and detail-oriented. But what's really extraordinary about this speech is President Lincoln voices his support for African-American men to receive the vote. So in this speech on April 11th, 1865, President Lincoln is supporting suffrage for African-American men. Some, he qualifies it, but those USCT soldiers who had proved themselves in battle, they are among the ones he thinks deserves the vote. And thinking about suffrage and voting rights, that's citizenship. That's defining freedom. So in this moment, he's taking abolition of slavery one step further. He's saying that, you know, to no longer be enslaved isn't the end of it, right? It is also citizenship and full rights within the United States. So really extraordinary, radical idea. There was one person in the crowd that night who didn't like the sound of that at all. John Wilkes Booth. So John Wilkes Booth was a passionate Confederate sympathizer. He was a white supremacist, using our vocabulary of today. He wanted slavery to continue. He wanted sort of that romantic notion of the antebellum South to be the thing that survived. He spent the whole war sort of playing around, you know, supporting the Confederacy in all sorts of ways. So he would march around with local militias, and he never joined the Confederate army because he promised his mother he wouldn't. He was a famous actor. He was touring all over the country. He was meeting up with other Confederate sympathizers. He made friends with people who were Confederate spies, and he tried to get his fingers into all of these ways to sort of help the Confederacy. He also hated President Lincoln. He really fixated it on President Lincoln as sort of the reason why the Confederacy was losing. And so when he was in the crowd that night listening to President Lincoln talking about suffrage and citizenship for African-American men, John Wilkes Booth turned to the guy next to him and said, "By God, I'll put him through. That's the last speech he'll ever give." So we think that in this moment, this is when John Wilkes Booth's thoughts turned to assassination, but he lacked the opportunity. And he would get that opportunity just 3 days later at Ford's Theater. So Ford's Theater, April 14th, 1865. The play that night was scheduled to be a comedy, Our American Cousin. Oops. And President Lincoln and Mrs. Lincoln, and they wanted to bring a couple guests. They wanted to come see the play. They wanted to relax, laugh, enjoy themselves, participate in the celebrations in Washington. And so they sent a message to Ford's Theater saying that they were going to come to the show that night. John Wilkes Booth happened to be there that morning. He was picking up his mail. He worked at Ford's Theater. He performed on that stage. President Lincoln had seen John Wilkes Booth perform on stage at Ford's Theater in 1863. So this was his opportunity. All day, the Ford brothers decorated the VIP box. They took out the temporary partition to expand it to make it this big deluxe box. They pulled the flags down from their own quarters and their neighbors. They decorated the box. They grabbed that portrait of George Washington and placed it there just so they really wanted to capitalize on this celebratory, festive atmosphere. I mentioned the play was called Our American Cousin. Super popular. This was going to be the 1000th performance of the show. Everybody loved it in 1865. It's not very funny today because some things just don't age well. All right. So John Wilkes Booth, though, he fixated on President Lincoln. He wanted to assassinate him, but he also wanted the Confederacy to win the war. And he knew that there was more to it than just assassinating one person. So John Wilkes Booth's plan was to decapitate the Union government. So he also targeted for that night the Secretary of State, William Seward, and the Vice President, Andrew Johnson. And in order to assassinate 3 different people in 3 different places, all at the same time, all on the same night, he needed help. And so he turned to that group of conspirators. They had met and been involved in a kidnapping plot that had never come to fruition. But John Wilkes Booth was able to gather around him these conspirators and lay out his plan to assassinate the president, the vice president, and the Secretary of State. So Lewis Powell in the upper left here, Lewis Powell was assigned to attack the Secretary of State. So William Seward, Secretary of State, had recently been in a carriage accident. He was recovering at home in bed. He was attended by nurses and doctors. Lewis Powell showed up on the evening of, at the night of April 14th, 1865 at about 10 o'clock at night. And he claimed he was from the doctor with medicine. He got in. He first encountered one of the Seward's older sons, Frederick. He tried to shoot Frederick Seward. The gun didn't go off, so he smashed him over the head with the gun. Instead, he went charging up the stairs. He found the Secretary of State's bedroom. He went in there. His gun's not working, so he pulled out a knife. He started stabbing the Secretary of State in bed. It's this horrifying attack. But people were home. They ran in. They wrestled Lewis Powell off of him. He stopped. He said, "I'm mad." And he ran out the door, jumped on his horse, galloped off into the night. Totally terrifying. But remarkably, Secretary of State Seward survived, recovers, continues serving in government. His son, Frederick, with the head injury, survives, recovers, continues serving in government. So the bloody attack at the Seward home fails. George Atzerodt was assigned to assassinate the vice president. George Atzerodt had joined this gang when it was a kidnapping plot. When it came to murder, he was not up for it. He went to the hotel where the president was staying. 10 o'clock rolls around. He cannot bring himself to kill the president in cold blood. He gets drunk and runs away, never attacks the vice president. Vice President Johnson sleeps through the whole thing, unharmed. David Harold is their getaway guy. I'll mention him again in just a little bit. And then the Surratts here at the bottom of the screen. So John Surratt was a Confederate spy. He operated his sort of espionage network out of his mother's tavern in Southern Maryland. So here's Mary Surratt, John Surratt's mother. John Surratt was probably the one who introduced John Wilkes Booth to all of these folks. John Surratt was actually not in the city on the day of the assassination. And his story is kind of interesting as like a epilogue. Mary Surratt owned a boarding house just around the corner from Ford's Theater, and she owned that tavern in Southern Maryland, and she delivered a package of supplies for John Wilkes Booth to pick up on his escape. Okay. So, at Ford's Theater. The play is scheduled to begin at 8. The president and his wife and their guests are late, so the play begins without them. At about 8:30, the president and his party arrive. They come in the front doors. They walk up a staircase just behind the audience here, and they cross the back of the balcony. Now, President Lincoln, he's kind of impossible to miss. So the lead actress stops the show. She has the band strike up "Hail to the Chief," and the president and his guests proceed across the back of the balcony to wild applause and cheers and this musical entrance, and they take their seats in the box. I like this angle as well. Gives you a really good sense of the theater. So President Lincoln was seated in the chair closest to the rest of the audience, closest to the door. Mrs. Lincoln sat next to him, and then they actually held hands during the show, which is really charming. It doesn't seem like a big deal to us today in 2021, but it was a really big deal to hold hands in public in 1865. Their guests were Mary's friend, Clara Harris. She sat in the chair closest to the stage, to our left, and her fiance, Major Henry Rathbone, who sat in a sofa sort of back behind. The play continued. John Wilkes Booth shows up at 9 o'clock at night. He shows up at the back door, leaves his horse with a stagehand. He comes in the theater. He goes under the stage, out a side door, and to the bar next door. He's waiting for 10 o'clock at night because he knows, I mean, the whole thing is his plan, right? And he knows that the funniest line of the show is going to be delivered at about 10 o'clock at night, and he wants to use that moment of mass distraction to sort of muffle the sound of his attack and get surprise on his side. So at about 10 o'clock at night, he comes in the front door of the theater. People recognize him. He walks up the same stairs and across the balcony, the same path that President Lincoln had walked just a couple hours before. And when he gets to this door, there's no security, there's no police, there are no soldiers, there's just a messenger. And to that messenger, he hands a calling card, like a business card, that says J.W. Booth. So he's not hiding who he is. He's not sneaking in. He walks right in, no questions asked. He jams that door shut behind him. Now he waits for this hilarious punchline. There's a single actor on stage. He delivers the line. The audience, just as John Wilkes Booth predicted, roars with laughter. They're clapping their hands. They're stomping their feet. They're making a huge commotion. John Wilkes Booth takes that moment to step right into the box behind President Lincoln, shoots him in the back of the head with his single shot 44 caliber Derringer pistol. Now this gun is actually kind of an old-fashioned gun for 1865, and so he doesn't take time to stop and reload it. As soon as he's fired the fatal shot, he throws it to the side and he whips out a knife. Major Rathbone had seen battle. He smells the gunpowder. He jumps up. He tries to stop John Wilkes Booth. They fight. John Wilkes Booth slashes at Major Rathbone, hitting him in the arm. John Wilkes Booth jumps out of the box, leaping over the front of the stage. He lands hard on the stage. About half of the historians I've ever talked to think that this is where he broke his leg. The others think he broke it on the escape. We can talk about that in a second. Broken leg or no, he can't stop. He won't stop. He just shot the president. So he's waving this bloody knife around and he says, "Sic semper tyrannis." Other witnesses thought he said, "The South is avenged." Either way, he runs out the back door, jumps on his horse, gallops off into the night. All of this happened, one of the witnesses said, all of this happened in a count of 8. Shock, surprise, confusion ripples through the audience. Everyone recognizes John Wilkes Booth. Was he part of the show? Was this some new special ending because of Union victory? But soon they realized that Major Rathbone is screaming, "Stop that man, stop that man." Mrs. Lincoln is screaming. It's chaos. There happen to be doctors in the audience. They get into the box. They realize President Lincoln has been shot. They realize the wound is fatal, and they decide to carry him out and find him a bed. So remember those dirt roads? They don't think they don't think President Lincoln would survive a carriage ride on those bumpy dirt roads, just the 6 blocks to the White House. So they start knocking on doors. They just want to get him somewhere comfortable where he can die with a little bit of dignity. So directly across the street, actually, I really like this painting. So the painting is, the artist is Carl Bursch, and he actually witnessed this moment. So he was standing on 10th Street taking sketches of the night, sketching the celebrations of Washington at the end of the war. And all of a sudden, this scene appears before him, and he describes the horror of the moment. And he sketched down what he saw, and he went back and painted this painting just a couple years later. So you can see President Lincoln here being carried across the street. So directly across the street is the Peterson boarding house. And one of the boarders saw the commotion and said, "Bring him in here." And so they did. And they took President Lincoln straight back into this back bedroom. That door at the end of the hall, that's the front door facing Ford's Theater. So they took him straight back into the back bedroom, whose occupant happened to be out that night. And they lay him in this bed. They did their best to make him comfortable. And President Lincoln died at 7:22 a.m. the following morning. Just a quick note about the fellow who rented that room. His name is Willie Clark, and this is Willie. And he wrote a letter to his sister, which we see on the right here. And he wrote this letter on April 19th, so just a few days after the assassination. So he comes home on Saturday morning, April 15th. The president's body has been removed, and he learns that the president had died in his bed. And he describes in this letter to his sister how he still has the blanket. He still has some of President Lincoln's clothes. He has the piece of lace that fell off of Mrs. Lincoln at some point. And he sends it to his sister, and he says, "You should keep this because it's got historical value." And the other thing he says is that hundreds of people come daily to see the room where President Lincoln died, and he has to watch them all because they're stealing his stuff. Everyone wants a physical memento from this place. Yes. Good question, Matthew. Let me answer that in just a little bit. Okay. Meanwhile, John Wilkes Booth is on the run. He escaped, galloped off on his horse into the night. So the investigation into the crime starts immediately, and this manhunt for John Wilkes Booth ensues. So he had escaped out of Ford's Theater. He gallops on his horse, crosses a Navy Yard bridge into Maryland, and he stops at the Surratt Tavern. Somewhere along in here, he meets up with David Harold, remember the getaway guy? So he was a local kid. He knew the area really well, and so he was key to this midnight escape. So they stop at Mary Surratt's Tavern, pick up those supplies that she had delivered. Now, at some point, John Wilkes Booth has broken his leg, either jumping out of the box, or his other version of the story is that he fell off of his horse, or the horse fell over on him and he broke his leg that way. That's the version of the story he told Dr. Mudd when they arrived at Dr. Mudd's house. The other version of the story is the one that he wrote in his own diary. So both versions of the story come from John Wilkes Booth himself, and he's the only one who could tell us which one's true. So I'll leave it to you to decide. After he gets his leg set at Dr. Mudd's house, they continue south. They're trying to make it to Virginia. They're trying to make it to the Confederacy. They get lost. They have to try again. The Union soldiers are hot on their heels this whole time. Finally, they arrive at the Garrett's farm in Port Royal, Virginia. The soldiers catch up with them on April 26th. By April 26th, the Garretts of the Garrett's farm are awfully suspicious of these two fellows who are looking pretty ragged, and they know that there's a manhunt for the assassin of President Lincoln. So they point the soldiers to the barn, and they say, the guys are locked in the barn. So the soldiers surround the barn. They demand that John Wilkes Booth and David Harold surrender. David Harold does surrender. John Wilkes Booth refuses to surrender. They light the barn on fire. They want to force him out of the barn. He refuses to come out of the barn. Boston Corbett, one of the soldiers, shoots John Wilkes Booth because he sees that he's armed. He's going to come out fighting, and he hits John Wilkes Booth in the neck, paralyzing him from the shoulders down. So they drag John Wilkes Booth out of the barn. The barn burns to the ground, and they go through his pockets and they question him as much as they can. His final words are, "Tell my mother I died for my country." And then he has the soldiers show him his own hands, and he says, "Useless, useless." So John Wilkes Booth dies on April 26th, 12 days after assassinating President Lincoln. Back at Ford's Theater, The city that had been in celebration is now in mourning. You can see the black fabric hanging out of the windows. The whole city was draped in black to mourn and demonstrate their grief. There are soldiers guarding the crime scene within. And then there were funeral proceedings held for President Lincoln. So the procession here on Pennsylvania Avenue was the beginning, and then Lincoln's body was transported on a train back to Springfield, Illinois, making many stops along the way so that the country could mourn the loss of its leader. And he rests today in the Lincoln family plot in Springfield, Illinois. 156 years after the fact, Ford's Theater is restored. So this is a crime scene photograph taken from the weekend of the assassination. And this is what Ford's looks like for us today. To answer, so we have a question from Facebook. Is it true that people came in after Lincoln was assassinated and grabbed the flags and portraits from the presidential box? Is there anything that was recovered and in the museum today? So people were grabbing mementos left and right from everything. The bunting flag that is on the front of the box here, that was kept by one of the actresses in the show that night. She kept it as a souvenir, brought it with her as she got married and moved to Pennsylvania. And so today it is in the Pike County Historical Society in Pennsylvania. The portrait of George Washington, we have the original. It was not ever absconded with, but we do not have it on display today because the original artifact is quite fragile, and we have it, you know, its place is out and in the light and in the dust and with the gravity and all of the goings on of the theater. The chair that President Lincoln was sitting in is in the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan. It was sold at some point. So in the moments after the assassination happened, there's this sort of chaos of realizing the historic moment, keeping artifacts, but also not valuing the artifacts, right? So there's chairs from the theater, which people value today, but back in 1865, nobody thought to save that chair, which is sort of interesting. Okay, but what's really special is that starting in 1968, 103 years after the assassination, Ford's Theater was a theater once more. And we have been doing plays on stage at Ford's Theater to be a living memorial to President Lincoln and not just a shrine to the tragedy of his death. So when you come to Ford's Theater, you can explore our museum, learn the story of President Lincoln's life and presidency in Washington, his assassination, the tragedy of his death, and then how that has impacted and changed the legacy of his leadership and of the Civil War all the way up through today. And then you can see a play at Ford's Theater and honor Lincoln's memory by doing something that he loved to do. So, and no matter what play is on stage, President Lincoln's box is always there. We never cover it up or change it. So sometimes we do plays, just sort of comic plays that are enjoyable and incidental. Sometimes we do history plays about President Lincoln. Sometimes we do musical comedies that have nothing to do with President Lincoln whatsoever. Sometimes we do history plays that explore other periods of our history. This was a play called Fly about the Tuskegee Airmen. But as I said, no matter what play is on stage, we always have President Lincoln's box. And you can just see the flags over here. So our last picture, this photograph was taken on the night of April 14th, 2015. So this was the 150th anniversary of the assassination. We had this extraordinary commemorative event, and about 2,000 people joined us on 10th Street to have a candlelight vigil to honor President Lincoln, to commemorate this tragedy in our history, and to really reflect and think about how much President Lincoln and the legacies of the Civil War, how freedom and equality continue to matter so much to us today, and how the legacies of this time period and of President Lincoln's life really reverberate even into our current moment. All right, I went a little bit over time, but I have a few minutes to stick around for questions. Thank you so much for joining me. Okay, question from Facebook. When was the theater used again after the assassination? So the theater was a theater in 1968. So it was 103 years between performances. But the building, so it was closed as a crime scene. The government occupied the building. They gave it back to John T. Ford of Ford's Theater in July of 1865. He tried to start another show, and people threatened to burn the building to the ground. They could not bear to have a show on stage in this place of tragedy. So the government bought the building, gutted the inside, turned it into an office building. It had this whole other life for the next 100 years. And so it was not until the 1960s that it was a theater once more. Good question. Did Lincoln's family or his wife's family visit the White House? Lincoln, I don't know about Lincoln's family. Mrs. Lincoln, actually, this was kind of a point of scandal. So Mrs. Lincoln was from Kentucky. And so she had family members who fought for the Confederacy. Her brother died for the Confederacy. She invited her sister-in-law, who was a grieving widow, to come stay in the White House. And so there were all sorts of these like scandalous rumors that Mrs. Lincoln was a spy for the Confederacy, and all this sort of gossip and fear-mongering in that case. But so we do know that Mary Lincoln's sister did come. Did presidents after Lincoln keep doing those office hour type meetings, or did security change after the assassination? Awesome question. So security, I would say security started to shift after the assassination, but it didn't become what we recognize today until well into the 20th century. So we've had 4 presidents assassinated in our country's history, and several more attempted assassinations besides. The White House was very accessible. It didn't have the kind of fencing around it that we think of today. I think all the way up until World War II. And then there was limitations put on visiting the White House then. You should totally check out the White House Historical Association to get all of these details totally right. But then, and then big shifts in security all throughout the city of Washington after 9/11. So a lot of the security measures and a lot of the fences and the higher fences and the thicker fences and the extra levels of metal detectors and all of that stuff is even as recent as just 20 years ago. Sorry, I'm reading the questions. I know I told Katie she could read them aloud to me, but I'm reading them myself. Lincoln was president during such a contentious time in U.S. history, and we're seeing that divide happen again today. What do you think Lincoln's words of advice would be to the country today? Oh, if only we could ask him. One of the things I find really interesting about President Lincoln, and we see this in some of his letters, we see it in other people's letters where they describe conversations with Lincoln. Lincoln had this real sense of what he personally believed and what he felt he had the power to do as president. And I think that his words of advice today would probably reflect a similar thing, right? He might say, I personally believe we should do this, but as president or the government should do that until, so he was very, he had this real appreciation for being an elected official and being accountable to the people who he was elected to serve, which again, includes people who didn't vote for him. And so I think one of the things that's really interesting, particularly when we study Frederick Douglass and President Lincoln, and we compare and contrast their leadership styles, Frederick Douglass was an activist. He advocated for change and he agitated for change, and he wanted the change soon and now, and he wanted it to be sweeping. And then President Lincoln, like Frederick Douglass chastises President Lincoln in many of his speeches for being too slow and for not making big dramatic change. And so President Lincoln, you can argue that President Lincoln knew that as an elected official, he couldn't make those dramatic changes that fast. He had to bring people along a little bit more, with a little bit more hand holding. And that tension is there, but that tension is also what helps drive things to get done. What happened to Elizabeth Keckley? Oh, so Elizabeth Keckley, her story is so amazing, and kind of tragic. So she was with Mrs. Lincoln through her grief. Elizabeth Keckley wrote that memoir a few years after President Lincoln's assassination, and she said that her intention in writing the memoir was to show sort of this side of the White House that people didn't know, and to drum up sympathy and support for Mrs. Lincoln, because Mrs. Lincoln was not universally liked. But really sadly, Mrs. Lincoln saw that memoir as more of an expose and a betrayal of her trust. And then that influenced Elizabeth Keckley's business, because women all of the sudden didn't trust her with their intimate lives and secrets anymore. And so they didn't want to shop with her anymore. So she sort of plummeted from her prestige, but she always remained committed to her church and committed to her charities that she supported. And her son, I mentioned her son joined the United States Army. He was light-skinned enough that he could pass for white. So he actually joined the United States Army before the USCT existed, and he was killed in battle. So she received a pension as the mother of a killed soldier, and she died in Washington D.C. in the early 1900s. So she lived a really long life, and the people who remember her from her later years always talk about how committed she was to her church community and to the DC community. What was the line from the play that John Wilkes Booth used to cover for his action? All right, I'll tell it to you, but you're not going to laugh because it's not funny anymore. But he said, oh, okay, so what the setting is, the guy on stage is yelling at this woman who was going to be his mother-in-law, but then the engagement got called off because everyone found out that he didn't have any money. And so he's hollering insults after his would-be mother-in-law. And he says, well, I know enough to turn you inside out, oh gal, you sockdologizing old man trap. So brought down the house in 1865. Did Lincoln have any pets? Yes, Lincoln loved animals. There's actually, so he had a dog back in Springfield, Illinois, and they actually have a photo of the dog. If you just look for Lincoln's dog, like a picture of Lincoln's dog, his dog was named Fido. And then, like I said, the boys had the goats. There's a really charming story of President Lincoln as a child rescuing a turtle. President Lincoln loved animals. Okay, I've read info on Dr. Samuel Mudd and that he was a Southern sympathizer, but other info states that he chased John Wilkes Booth and David Harold out as he feared for his life and his family, and he rode into town later that day. Can you elaborate a little more about him? Okay, so Dr. Mudd claimed that he didn't know who John Wilkes Booth was. He claimed, I think what you said you read, that he claimed that he chased them out because he was afraid, and he went to town and reported them. Problem is, there were witnesses who reported seeing Dr. Mudd and John Wilkes Booth meet earlier, like not that day, but like in time, like they'd met before, probably as part of this Confederate spy network. He sat on this information that he treated a guy for a broken leg in the middle of the night for 3 days. So there were Union soldiers investigating and asking for information and asking people to come forward for 3 days before before Dr. Mudd was like, and now I'll reveal this information that I know. So mighty suspicious. He was arrested and tried with the other conspirators, and he was found guilty of conspiracy. And then he was pardoned later. Wonderfully complicated story.
All right, well, Alex, thank you so much for being with us today. I know we ran a bit over, so thank you for staying on, and just thank you for teaching us so much more about Lincoln and Ford's Theater. This was great to be a part of.
Awesome, thank you for having me. Sorry I went a little long, but there's too many stories and not enough time. So I hope you all come visit us again.
No one's complaining about running long. Sorry about keeping you on for a bit longer. And anyone who's watching, if you are interested, if you'd like to learn more about the distance learning materials from Ford's Theater, you can reach Alex at education@fords.org. And more information can also be found at the link on the screen right now. And again, thank you all for joining us today. We'll be continuing the National History Academy virtual tour series next week, same time at 4 p.m. on Wednesday, with a tour of the 6th floor museum. So hopefully see you there.